Hello and welcome to the fourth video in this series on Dataman Multi-Reader Sync. In this video, I will discuss some of the common issues you may encounter during MRS setup and show some tricks that help me when I configure reader groups. My first gotcha is proper networking. Ensure your devices are in the same IP subnet and have compatible addresses. IP mismatches may not cause issues directly, but it is best practice to put readers on the same subnet or DHCP server and will prevent the possibility of other issues. With that out of the way, my next tip is to use continuous or burst trigger modes and not single external, even if you only want one capture for each trigger. This is because of known incompatibility. As of Dataman firmware version 6.1.10, single external triggering is not designed to send a trigger off signal, which can cause skip triggers on secondary readers in MRS. It's possible that new versions will work differently. If you only want a single capture for each trigger, you can set a high trigger interval. This will simulate single external mode, if your interval is higher than your expected trigger signal length. This is because the trigger will end before the next capture occurs. If you instead want multiple captures in a trigger, then you should be sure to avoid an interval that is too short. In continuous external mode, decoding can be cut short by subsequent image captures, so you should always set your interval to be well above your expected decode time. Make sure you factor in more time if you have multiple codes and symbologies as well. I recommend checking your decode times and setting the interval to at least 10 milliseconds higher. If you need to capture faster, then you should use burst mode. In burst mode, captures do not interrupt decoding. My final triggering hint is to ensure that you are definitely triggering from your primary device. If you trigger from a secondary device, all the devices will trigger, but your timing cycle will be incorrect. I've gotten false no reads from triggering a secondary reader directly in an MRS group. Moving from trigger settings to timeouts. Timeouts are a key part of MRS setup. They are like the grease in a machine, making sure everything runs smoothly. The correct secondary reader timeout for your application will depend on your trigger settings, code type, and even imager settings, so there is no single correct value. As a rule, your secondary reader timeout should be greater than your expected capture and decode times together, but not longer than the time between your trigger signals. Set this value on the primary reader. So, if I have a 2 millisecond acquisition time and a decode time of 32 milliseconds with an arbitrary trigger length and a 60 millisecond gap as shown here, then I need a timeout of at least 35 milliseconds but not up to 60 milliseconds. In this case, 50 milliseconds may be best. That allows more than enough time for decoding without running into the next trigger signal. Remember to always think about your worst case decode times when doing these calculations. If you are running into timing challenges, then using output delay may give you some control and consistency. Find this setting in the Output Delay tab of Inputs Outputs. This value determines when your results are sent, regardless of good read or no read status. So I could always wait 50 milliseconds after the end of my trigger before sending results. Or even better, I could always send my results exactly 100 milliseconds after the start of my trigger to ensure that I never overrun into the next rising edge of my trigger. If you use this setting, it is important to still account for the time it will take for your secondary readers to respond. Otherwise, you will neglect to collect possible good reads from secondary readers and have unnecessary no reads. Output delay is crucial when you have long trigger signals with short breaks between. Imagine, for example, that you are using a photo eye with a long product that has short gapping. In this case, the trigger length will be very long, and the secondary reader timeout would not engage until the trigger signal goes low. That would be very risky timing. Instead, you could force your secondary readers to return sooner with output delay on each of them, and return at a consistent time from the primary device as well, all coordinated around the beginning of the trigger signal, not the end of the trigger signal. If you have thought long and hard about your timeouts and delays but are still having issues, it may be worth comparing the configurations of your devices. On the Connect page of Setup Tool, simply select the readers in your group and click Compare Configurations. I have used this page to find mismatched timeout and delay values even when I was sure I had set them all properly. Values that differ from the leftmost configuration are highlighted, so finding possible problems is even easier. My last debugging tip is about removing readers from MRS groups. Sometimes we get our setups wrong and need to start over. If you can, the best way to remove a reader from a group is to reset the device settings. You can do this without a full system reset by clicking the Reset Configuration button in Setup Tool. This way, no other settings will persist and affect your new setup. If you want to keep your settings and simply remove the device from the group, then you can manually remove it as a node in Setup Tool. Just open Group Editing, disable Group Triggering, then apply the settings. Then remove the node and apply settings again. This should put them in independent triggering mode without a group. While you can use Setup Tool for this, I highly recommend using Edge Intelligence if possible. All you need to do in EI is edit the group, then disable group triggering, and save your settings. That concludes this video. Thank you for watching. In the next video, I will show you how to set up 360-degree scan systems for food and beverage.